Do you have an idea of what human rights are? Are there a list? Are there a number of them? Is it like the Bill of Rights? Is there a list you can check off to make sure that each one of your human rights is being honored? Ask yourself that question. What the are human rights? Because we do talk about it all the time. But what are human rights? Can you find a list? Can you make sure you can check off each one so that you can make sure you're getting your rights? Also, in the event that you get that list of human rights, wherever you find it, let's say you get to one item on the list and your right is not being honored. Who do you take that up with? Is it a lawsuit? Do you call the police? Who gets in trouble if you're not getting one of your human rights? If you're not getting your human rights, who can you go to hold someone accountable? This is the G Podcast. This is the G Podcast, where we focus on family, friends, finances, freedom, and our future, and everything else. This is the G Podcast. I greatly appreciate y'all tuning in. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, like the video, and I really encourage y'all to leave your thoughts in the comments. We got a great one for you today. Colonialism. Do you even know what it is, what it means? I had really no clue what it truly meant, even though I had heard the term in different contexts growing up. I've always heard about the 13 colonies, right? I've always heard about the 13 colonies, the United States. Growing up in North Carolina, one of the original 13 colonies, you hear about this. But there's also like an order of operations too. Like they weren't all 13 colonies at the same time. Little by little did it grow and did it grow. This idea of colonialism and how it's impacted, especially today, modern day, what you and I know to be the present world, I think it's so emphasized. We don't discuss it enough, and how it relates and how it intertwines with everything that's taking place. This is a global game. It's not local, it's global. And when you grow up, especially in the US, and you haven't been, say, across the Atlantic or across the Pacific, you are in a bubble. I'm telling you, you are in a bubble. And it's not even that it's very tough. I would argue it's damn near impossible to mimic the experience of travel, not just traveling, but immersing yourself in different cultures, especially when you grow up as an American, even more so when you grow up as a Black American. You have to get out there and see other things because it'll change your perception. I grew up in North Carolina. All I knew was Black people, white people. But when you live in somewhere like Amsterdam, there's white people. But then you see Black people, but it's not like they're all the same Black. They don't all speak the same language. And that was when I learned about a small country called Suriname in South America, just north of Brazil. And as a Black person living in Amsterdam, I immediately noticed the influence of the Surinamese population in that city. It's undeniable. And shout out to my Surinamese brethren and my barber. Hey, Lionel, if you watching, Lionel, I appreciate you. He helped me go bald. Hey, look, man, for those, this is a complete side note because I know what that's like too, my brothers. I know what it's like, my brothers. I know what it's like. I mean, you might even see the little pic. Man, I had them 360s going back in the day, man. Just thick, wavy. I get it, my brother. When that thing started to fade, man, that line just... consider just letting it go. My guy Lionel, he helped me get comfortable with that whole process before I started shaving myself. But he was a Black person that I met in Amsterdam, but he was of Surinamese descent. And then you start learning about these different cultures that as an American, I had never even heard of Suriname. I heard about this place once I got to Amsterdam, but that's when you find out that they were a Dutch colony. Hence why there is such a significant population there. And then you start learning about other Dutch colonies, because also before I had moved to the Amsterdam, I had never really had Indonesian food, never had Indonesian food. But when I went to Amsterdam, I got to experience Surinamese culture to some extent and Indonesian, which was very different. Also was a Dutch colony, Indonesia. The Dutch, man, they were very entrepreneurial, if you will, as it relates to their like conquest. They were like, a very small piece of Europe, but man, they really found ways to get what they needed, right? And then they were like, they created the first stock market, for example. So just very entrepreneurial, masters of the sea and facilitators of that slave trade and getting stuff from one place to the next, like spice trade. The Dutch definitely had a unique rise to their, let's say, power and wealth. And I didn't really know about any of this until I got there. And as I start walking around the city, beautiful city, Amsterdam, you start looking at buildings and places, and they're literally older than America. They're literally older than America. It's like, wow, this is a very different part of the world than where I grew up. And when I look around, it's so small, but yet it's so influential. And it's like, why? And then when I was there, I would travel. We went to Belgium, even like smaller country. That's one of the crazy things about Europe, man. We stay in Amsterdam. You hop on a train, you're like 2 hours from Brussels. Maybe another 2 hours or less, you're from Antwerp, which are both two cities in Belgium. And that is such a small city, but man, they have some beautiful cities, some beautiful buildings, like, and a lot of this stuff again is as old, if not older, than all of America, which means they've been at this for a while. Living over there, being that close to this imperial regime that you just read about, like, you're actually in these countries. I went to France, I went to the UK, I went to the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain. Like I went to all these different places, Portugal. And these are some of the biggest imperial powers that reigned in this colonial era, where they literally had a chunk. If you look at everywhere I just named, they literally had a chunk of everywhere outside of Europe, literally. And so the thing about colonialism, you might say like, okay, interesting. When I was living over in Amsterdam, you're learning all of this, and that's just from being in the city, traveling, doing things. But while I was in Amsterdam, I also was in grad school. And for me, one of the toughest things about grad school was that master's thesis. It was a rigorous process to get it done. And it really pushed me beyond limits that I even knew I was capable of at the time. I cannot lie to you. One of the things I did not expect to uncover while preparing for this thesis was this idea of colonialism, because I was in the school of business. But what ended up happening was it was time to do the thesis, and there were like certain subjects or groups in which you could choose related to what was international management. So for me, I was drawn to this idea of human rights. What I was also drawn to was the idea of colonialism as it relates to human rights, because I found that term so interesting living there. I just found it so interesting. Human rights. What my whole thesis, the question was, it was an exploratory study centered around human rights. And the question ultimately was, does a colonial relationship between the home and host country of a multinational enterprise influence how it responds to an alleged human rights violation? Now, I know that was a bit long of a sentence. That's how that academic mumbo jumbo be going, man. It's a crazy way that these people talk. But I'll repeat it again. And just to give a little bit more context, multinational enterprise, or MNE, right? A multinational enterprise is simply a company or a business that has offices in multiple countries, not just one country. So if you are, say, Apple, and you have a headquarters in was it California? And then you have another office location somewhere else, maybe in Europe or Asia, right? Like you have office locations or you do business in multiple countries. The question was, does a colonial relationship between the home and host country of a multinational enterprise? And so in that example, let's say a home and host country, let's say it's British Petroleum and you're a gas company, right? That's a British gas company. So Nigeria was a British colony, definitely a lot of oil, right? So if I am BP and I am doing business in Nigeria, that would be an example of a home and host country of a multinational enterprise with a colonial link, because Nigeria was a British colony. And so I wanted to explore how that sort of relationship influenced how these sort of companies responded to an alleged human rights violation. And so you might say, okay, interesting. I think it was too. When we look at this idea of human rights, and this is before I started even getting into the research, I started thinking like human rights, like, well, the bulk of human rights violations, you hear about this in these Black and brown impoverished nations. Like you hear about it mostly in Africa and Asia, in these sweatshop-like environments, or these environments of just, it's typically in those locations. That's what I would say from just when I started hearing about human rights in the first place, which was why I was sort of drawn to like, well, what kind of research is behind this? Some of the more common human rights violations is definitely like in retail, when you talk about sweatshops and things of that nature. But you also see it in other industries like oil and gas, and you just see it in so many different elements. And so with that being the basis of the thesis, that requires a significant amount of research on the concept of human rights in a business context, but it's in an academic context as well. So this is like through research publications, this idea of human rights. Also, the idea of colonialism. You have to speak about it not from your opinion, but from a research-based approach. You can't just go out there and say like, oh man, this is some bullshit, like colonialism shouldn't exist. Like you have to have research and evidence. It's not just an opinion, right? So you have to find research on all of these things so you can find something to help answer this question, right? The first thing that really sort of got my attention was the idea of human rights. Human rights is an interesting concept, and I found this interesting for a few different reasons, but this idea of human rights, I'm just going to pause for a second. Do you even really have an understanding of what human rights are? Because we talk about it all the time. Do you have an idea of what human rights are? Are there a list? Are there a number of them? Is it like the Bill of Rights? Is there a list you can check off to make sure that each one of your human rights is being honored? Ask yourself that question. What the f*** are human rights? Because we do talk about it all the time. But what are human rights? Can you find a list? Can you make sure you can check off each one so that you can make sure you're getting your rights? Also, in the event that you get that list of human rights, wherever you find it, let's say you get to one item on the list and your right is not being honored. Who do you take that up with? Is it a lawsuit? Do you call the police? Who gets in trouble if you're not getting one of your human rights? If you're not getting your human rights, who can you go to hold someone accountable? Furthermore, who owes you those human rights? Are they even your rights? Like, who is the one or the entity indebted to give you these rights? The sky? The government? All governments? What are human rights? I want you to think about that, because before I did this thesis, I started to realize that I didn't have answers to those questions. But yet we talk about human rights so much, especially in a business context and other contexts. You might be surprised to know that this term, human rights, I have it here. Let me take a look. It was not until 1948 that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1948. This is the first time an international document expressed a list of rights in which each human is entitled. This is 1948. Now you might say, man, how do you know this? This is from I got sources. This is from something involved with the United Declaration of Human Rights itself. This is their own words. This isn't my words. This is from the UN's own material that they published in 2015. This idea of human rights, it didn't exist really on this scale until 1948. I think that's interesting. Let's continue though. The United Nations. That is a very influential, powerful organization that has a huge impact on not just the US, but there are so many parties involved. But what is it? How was it formed? When was it formed? Why was it formed? I'm gonna be honest. Before I started going down this wormhole of research, I honestly had no clue about the United Nations other than it was an international organization. That's what I knew. That's really all I knew. Actually, I also knew they had something going in New York, like some United Nations thing in New York City. But the United Nations, again, if we take a step back, it was the United Nations and their Universal Declaration of Human Rights that brought this term human rights to the forefront internationally. That was 1948. But the United Nations didn't exist until shortly after World War II. The United Nations wasn't even a thing until shortly after World War II. So we're talking just after 1945. Within 2 to 3 years of the UN's creation, post-World War II, we had this idea of human rights. Now let's just look at that time period objectively, because we're talking 1940s, and yet we're talking about human rights, a list of rights in which each human is entitled. When we look at that time period and the parties involved here in forming the UN, I think there are some just interesting things to highlight. Mind you, too, 1940s, my parents were born in the 50s. And so this idea of human rights, like my parents and their siblings, they're the first generation born with this even being a thought. The idea that humans are entitled to just things because they're humans. But even then, because even though the UN came to be, there were only 51 member states. We'll have to talk about that because at the time when they created this thing, let me see, UN membership did not include nations that were controlled by colonial powers. So even though they created this United Nations in 1945-ish, 46, and came up with this idea of human rights just a few years later, a lot of these UN founding members were colonizers who had colonies. Very interesting concept. So let's talk more about this whole thing with the human rights, because how is that? How do those two things exist at the same time? How are you, the UK, for example, France, for example, the US, for example, how are you at the table to bring up this idea of like human rights in the 1940s when, especially in the US, it's still segregated? Civil rights movement in the US didn't even take place until the 60s. What type of human rights are you really even talking about in the 1940s? And who do they apply to? When you look at not the US, maybe from a segregation standpoint and Jim Crow, France and the UK, I mean, they literally own so much of Africa and Asia, like at this time period, talking about human rights. This is the looniness of people in power. I'm just laying it out as clear as day. This is not like, this is literally what it was and arguably still what it very much is. These concepts being created talking about human rights, but they don't necessarily apply to all humans. Same deal, right? Here in the US, when we talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all men are, it's like, but they had slaves. So it's like, we know that these laws weren't equally applied. We understand this. We understand that when these institutions in the form of countries, these sovereign nations, when they make laws, it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone living in the country. And so how is it that these powers like the US and the UK and France and many others are at the table talking about human rights, but yet they're taking place, or they themselves are taking part in segregation, Jim Crow in the US, and colonialism across the world? And the US too is not guilty, is not innocent of being a colonizer. They took part in this as well. And we can't leave out Japan. They were doing their imperial thing. All right. You got to look at the history of like who was colonizing who and on what, like, and then you start to see that there were times where within certain, like Ethiopia and Eritrea, for example, like I don't want to go into too much detail here because I'm not an expert, but these are very interesting things in history to me. This idea of the human rights, 1948, came to be just after World War II. Now, let's not ignore the obvious. Let's not ignore the obvious. And I'm not going to talk about this from a opinion standpoint. This is all from research. And so the UN came to be just after World War II. World War II was a contributing factor that helped shape the creation of the Declaration of Human Rights, mainly because the Holocaust and the human rights violations that took place by the Nazi government, that was one of the arguably the most influential factors in the United Nations creating a Declaration of Human Rights, a universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the Holocaust. In addition to preventing another world war, what the UN wanted to do was prevent human rights violations similar to those witnessed during World War II. This is cited Eckert 2001. This is not me. This is what the research is saying. And so I found that very interesting because I had never put those things together personally. When I heard about the United Nations, I had never thought about how it came to be. And we're just really skimming the surface there, the tip of the iceberg. It came to be just after that World War II period. And then the powers that be, the initial 51 founding states, many of them were imperial powers who were colonizers. And in just 2 to 3 years, they were so impacted by the events of the Holocaust, they said, man, we need to have a universal Declaration of Human Rights, even though we have been colonizing countries for decades. I think that's interesting. The impact of World War II and the atrocities that took place and how that motivated these imperial powers to come together to protect human rights while still not applying that thought and those human rights to other people, I think is a very interesting thing to point out. Because in that time period from, say, the mid 40s to the mid 60s, so much Jim Crow, segregation, oppression of Black and brown people here in the United States. In that same time period, many of these countries, they didn't start to gain their independence until the late 50s, all the way through, some of them not until the 70s, okay? A lot of these countries in Africa and Asia can't even say that they were free of a colonial power until the 60s, 70s. Like one generation, like my parents were born and their siblings were born in that 50s, 60s range. That is the range of time in which colonialism started to phase out. So this is not an old concept, and it still somewhat exists today, but it just called different things. It gets deep. So the fact that because the Holocaust took place is what made a international society think that we have to do something to give people rights is interesting. But it also highlights how there is a clear separation of there's a separation of what is perceived, of how people are perceived. Because I don't know how you reconcile that these things exist at the same time. We're talking about human rights while we're colonizing the bulk of the brown and black world. Like, I do not understand this. And if you talk to people who grew up in these former colonies, like, even though the US was a former colony, I'm talking about like countries like Kenya, for example, Jamaica, countries who didn't get their independence until like a few decades ago. That's a little different. And when the UN was created, if you were controlled by a colonial power, you couldn't be a member. So your United Nations talking about Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but hey, look, y'all folks over here, nah, y'all can't be a part of this club. It's so silly. It's so silly. But yet, till this day, that entity, the United Nations, has such an influence. Colonized nations were not eligible. And just as a side note, it is estimated, and this is from the UN. This is from a United Nations document published in 2016. It is estimated that 750 million people lived in locations that were ruled by a colonial power or nation that was considered non-self-governing, which represented nearly 1/3 of the world's population at the time. So at the time when the United Nations was created, in the mid-40s, 1/3 of the world's population was being colonized or in a situation where they weren't considered self-governed. They were being controlled by somebody else, 1/3. And of that 1/3, I can't tell you how much of those people were either in Africa or Asia or brown by nature in South America. Like, it's very clear where that third existed. So very interesting sort of like light bulbs going off as I'm starting to go through this research. Had no clue how the UN even came to be. Had no clue that this idea of human rights wasn't even a real idea until the UN had came to be. And I immediately just noticed the hypocrisy of the UN coming up with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights while also being these colonial powers who were colonizing so much of the world. So let's talk a little bit more. That was the, I would say, impactful research that just opened up my eyes as it relates to human rights. And as I said at the beginning, the whole basis of the thesis was around human rights and this colonial link between home and host countries. So the fact that the concept of human rights was created by colonizers is already like, the fact that human rights was created by a group of colonizers, like, that's the reality. This is why I say you have to be careful with like why you get so charged up to do what you do, because human rights, they didn't even see us as human beings when this was created. Human rights was created, the way they was treating black folks in America, they definitely didn't apply those human rights here. You could argue in certain situations they still don't, but we're not even gonna go down that road. So I went down the human rights road, figured out human rights, how that came to be, but then I also needed to go do research on colonialism. But you also have to do this. It starts because it's a business thesis. So it's colonialism in the context of business, but it requires research on colonialism as a whole. And so the initial sort of uncovering that I saw in the research that gave me this idea to explore this link had to do with the likelihood of trade between countries that have a colonial link. I thought this was just like so eye-opening. I apologize, I can't say these names that well, but Gamma Watt, very popular international business research person, 2001, Franklin and Rose, 2000. A colonial relationship between home and host country will increase the likelihood of trade by 900%. Think about that. That means that if I am Haiti and you are France, there's a 900% likelihood I'm going to do trade with France if I'm Haiti. When we look at trade and we look at wealth and accumulation of wealth at a global scale, when there's a 900% likelihood that you're going to do trade with the colonizer of your country, a lot of your wealth is being redistributed to your oppressor. And that goes across the table. This is not like a link just for a certain, like this is across the board. It increases the likelihood of trade 900%. I think that's so impactful because we are in a global world, global markets. The world moves together now. Like it's shrunken significantly over time. We're so much more connected. But colonialism was not that long ago. And it has a huge impact on why globalization has taken place the way it's taken place, because it sort of started with colonialism. You know, like this is crazy. When I saw that in the research, that link had such an impact on trade, I immediately started thinking, man, how could it impact human rights and how these companies respond to human rights violations? So that's how this whole thing sort of came to be. And that's why I had to go down that wormhole studying colonialism. And so colonialism, let's talk about it. Colonial relationship is a dynamic in which one state has direct control over another state using multiple mechanisms. That's a definition from Ratner, 2001. So when we talk about this relationship of colonizer and colony, this is what we're talking about when one state has direct control over another using multiple mechanisms. Okay. The colonizer would also typically adopt sovereignty over the colony. That is from Angie, 1999. I apologize if I say that wrong. Sovereignty over the colony essentially means the colonizer is going to dictate the rules and regulations of the colony. The colony won't have its own say in how it's ran in the culture that exists. They have to follow the rules of the colonizer. Angie argues, this is from that same 1999 article, that major European countries colonized essentially all states in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific by 1914. I want to pause there because let's put this in context. Let's put it in context. Slavery in the US, you're talking 1860s, it was abolished, right? And so what this is saying is, okay, if we're looking at 1860s, slavery was abolished. Between 1860s, 1870s, when slavery is ending, and the early 1900s, that 30, 40-year period, colonialism is spreading. And by 1914, according to this article, all states in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were colonized by major European countries. So from 1914 and on, like you're talking decades of control. It's not, and it is by force. Let's be clear. Colonialism is, I don't know. I think because it's not slavery, it gets like looked over in a way. It's almost like colonialism is almost like COVID slavery. It's like it's like slavery from home. It's like remote slavery. We don't gotta go there. We could just log in and reap the benefits without having to go there and do the work. It's crazy. So colonialism, man, it really had a huge impact on the world and especially these Black and brown places, Africa, Asia, and Pacific. Colonial relationships are one of the most critical aspects to examine in understanding the disparities of economic success. That's Ingerman and Sokoloff, 2002. I think that's pretty clear because we just sort of went over this. By 1914, everything had been taken. World War II takes place in the 40s. A United Nations is created, and yet at that time, 1/3 of the world was still being colonized. According to, I cannot say this name, but European colonialism reversed the levels of development in many countries outside of Europe. That is from 2 different articles. Also, Keith and Agundale, 2007, examined the influence of British and French colonial ties on human rights behavior in former colonies located in Africa. They found evidence to suggest that former British colonies have worse human rights records than former French colonies. I started thinking about, okay, are Brits more cruel than the French? I don't know, but chattel slavery, I think, was uniquely cruel, and that existed in these original colonies. That's where it was bread and butter. That's where it was made. So maybe there is something to that. I don't know. This research was so eye-opening and impactful. And I started to ask myself, like, why don't we emphasize this more in the schools when we teach about history and the impact of how history shapes modern society? Colonialism has such an impact on where we are today. And the research suggests that it's had an impact on so many different ways that we live our lives. As we continue, I don't have much more to add here because I don't want to make this say unnecessarily long. Pause. But colonialism, we speak about the impact. One of the other things about it is that it was so gradual, whether it be the onset or the conclusion. So again, it's like, just because you might have independence in a certain year, it doesn't necessarily mean that the colonizer didn't have power over you once you were independent. And I think most colonies, if you just look at these colonies, you would see that very clearly. Even if they're quote unquote independent, there's something there that exists. There's a debt that's either paid to their colonizer or something. You're not just scot-free independent of your colonizer, even when you're independent. Another crazy thing about colonialism is that some of these countries, man, they had more than one colonizer at a time, like in a certain territory. Might be multiple imperial countries who claim a piece of a land. I had no clue about any of this stuff. And when I started thinking about the more micro societies and like the stuff that's been driving us most recently, a lot of race and power and equality, and when in reality, human rights weren't even created for us. Just think about that. Human rights weren't even created with us in mind. And when I say us, you could do the math on who us is. You could do the math. It's in the research. It's in the research. Us is not everybody. When I say they, the people in power, the entities in power, there's a certain club that gets to play in the sandbox. And so when we talk about freedom and future, I think it's important to understand, like, these entities that are in power, they are there for a reason. And they're not just going to willingly give that power away to anyone. They're not going to do that. And when we as individuals walk around talking about equality and rights, and who were these things really written for? That's the first question. Why do you feel so entitled to something that's not for you? I think we need to find a different approach, ultimately, for a lot of the reasons that I'm pointing out. This is why I say, well, what is equality? What was ever equal? When? When did equality ever exist here? At what point? Before here was even a thought. You look at European history, it ain't equal. It ain't equality. I can tell you that much. You can watch Game of Thrones, see that it ain't equality there either. Like, what is equality? And why does it mean so much to you? I think that we often get caught up in the wrong, spending our time and energy in the wrong concepts when we need to be more realistic and strategic with the approach if we're really trying to get different outcomes. If we're really trying to get different outcomes, we can't afford to let the people in power dictate how we're going to get the outcome. It would be silly. If you want different outcomes, you can't chase the carrot that they dangle in front of you with words like equality and human rights. Because they literally created these things, not giving a shit about you. I think that's where we're going to drop here today. I just wanted to share this story about colonialism, what it is, how it's had an impact on what I feel is modern day society. Give you just a few nuggets that I came across doing the research. And I don't even want to present as much my opinion on a lot of these things. I just want to give you the objective research that I found and that I thought was interesting and worth sharing. Very impactful on where we are today and worth more investigation. I would encourage you just to go explore. It's an important part of history. And if we really want to make sure that we are navigating to the future that we want for ourselves and our community, we have to understand how we got to this point so we can make better decisions moving forward. We can't keep chasing the same ghost of the past. Like, come on. This is the G Podcast. I greatly appreciate y'all tuning in. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you like the video. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. If you yourself grew up in a country that was colonized, or maybe you moved to one of those countries. I know, especially living in Amsterdam, I met mad people who ended up moving to the country that was the colonizer of their country. So especially in the UK, you see so many people from those colonies across Africa, for sure. The Caribbean, for sure. You see them migrate over to the UK. Colonialism has a huge impact on the global society today. I think we should talk about this more. I hope y'all enjoyed today's discussion. This is the G Podcast.
It doesn't matter how you feel.
Hi. Appreciate y'all listening. Make sure you subscribe. This is the G Podcast, where we focus on family, friends, finances, freedom, and our future, and everything else. You heard? This is the G Podcast. Let's go.
It doesn't matter how you feel.
All right, we good right there. That ended there.